Environmental defenders face many risks while protecting Jamaica's natural resources. They often lack adequate access to information, access to justice, and access to participation in decision making. This is where the Escazú Agreement comes in. It's a landmark regional treaty designed to provide greater access to justice, adequate information, and meaningful participation in decision making while ensuring stronger protections for environmental defenders. Hello, my global family. I'm Dana Lynn, and welcome to a special podcast series called Defending Our Rights, Environmental Justice in Jamaica, brought to you by the Jamaica Environment Trust in collaboration with Global Yadi, with support from the UNDP implemented Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program. So in this series, we're exploring the Escazú Agreement and what it means for securing environmental rights in Jamaica. In this episode, we're joined by veteran broadcast journalist and attorney at law, Dionne Jackson Miller, as we explore the role of media in amplifying environmental awareness or justice. And we'll be exploring some of the threats, if any, that journalists may face in environmental reporting and how media can better support environmental awareness and justice. Welcome, Dionne.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Great to be here.
All right, thank you. So my first question for you, how would you describe the media's role or responsibility in shaping how the public understand environmental justice or issues relating?
I think it's a really critical role because one of the adages you hear about media is that we're supposed to be the voice for the voiceless. And a lot of times in environmental justice, that really is what people need. A lot of times people are living in situations in which their basic constitutional right to a free environment, as we have in our constitution, is being infringed, whether by air pollution, noise pollution, water pollution. We're seeing the problems with the Rio Cobra, for instance, that the people along the banks are having. And many times those stories are brought to life because of media. Somebody gives you a call and it's on CVM, it's on TVJ, it's on the front pages of the Gleaner and the Observer, and suddenly policymakers and legislators are sitting up and taking notice and taking action.
We often hear, I don't know, still people will talk about, environmental issues aren't sexy, or generally that we have a challenge maybe with environmental literacy. So do you think how we cover or report on environmental issues impact how the public understands environmental issues like pollution and climate change and the like?
Yeah, it's one of the difficulties of reporting in general. I think sometimes we forget that our role is to tell stories, to bring issues through life through telling stories and through humanizing them. So, you said the Escazú Agreement and people's eyes might start to glaze over, oh my gosh, what's that? And not international treaties and whatever. But if you tell the story through a fisherman or fisherwoman who is having difficulty because of the ongoing pollution of the Rio Cobra, and you put the issue in terms of their right to have a livelihood, the devastation to their way of life as a result of repeated incidents of pollution, suddenly people aren't seeing this as a boring international treaty. They're seeing it as a story about people and how to help people. And that's always the challenge of journalism, and that's one of the issues I think I see a lot of the times when I look at how we cover environmental issues. We're not focusing enough on people. Once you start, people are interested in people. Once you're telling stories about people, then the audience is going to be interested once it's told well. So the challenge is always how to get the story out of Parliament, get the story out of international law, and put it in villages, in communities, in people's homes.
Yes. One of the things that we find sometimes, maybe from observation or when we follow stories in the media, when environmental issues are reported, it's like the authorities or entities or any persons named, sometimes it feels like they're being defensive, or it's always, I don't know what to say. I don't want to say an awkward time, but a tense. It plays out in a lot of tension. And so sometimes we often wonder, how does that affect the journalists or reporters that cover these stories? Do we have examples or experiences of intimidation and other challenges locally when covering these kinds of stories?
I don't know if I'd go as far as to say intimidation, but I do say to reporters, if you're telling stories that matter, If you're challenging those in authority, if you're saying to the regulators, to the parliamentarians, to the MPs, to the civil servants, you're not doing your job, people aren't necessarily going to like you, but that's not what our job is. If you're doing your job in a way that everybody likes you, you're probably not doing it properly. So if you're going to be in journalism seriously, and you intend to seriously talk about the issues that are affecting people and the way in which the civil servants and the policymakers' inadequacies are affecting the people they're supposed to be serving, then people aren't going to like you. There is going to be pushback. There is going to be blowback. And you have to figure out how to deal with that, whether through your newsroom, if you're working in a newsroom, working within your network, getting advice from older journalists again. But you do have to start from the premise that, hey, I'm publishing this story that's going to make people look bad. They're not going to like me. Maybe not going to be on the Christmas party list, and that's okay. It means you're doing what you're supposed to be doing.
That's solid reflection there. So intimidation may not be par for the course, certainly in perhaps Jamaica. Yeah. We know in Latin America, and it's more extreme for a lot of persons, for defenders and reporters and so on. But are there other challenges that journalists in Jamaica have to navigate when covering environmental stories?
Yeah, when we look at what the environmental defenders, as you said, in Latin American countries have to face, downright physical intimidation, many of them killed in many cases, then you really can't compare what it is we go through. But we do face a lot of roadblocks in terms of people trying to stall you. A lot of people who use our Access to Information Act, which is access to environmental information, as you know, is one of the pillars of the Escazú Agreement. They'll tell you, people say to me all the time, the act doesn't work. They can't get the information, but a lot of the times it's because people don't push the act to the edges. You make you make the application for information. You don't get the information, you can go on to appeal that. People don't know that. So a lot of people get discouraged when they don't get the information. And a lot of that information, really valuable information, is the groundwork, it's a foundation in telling some of these environmental stories that we need to tell.
Speaking about the act, and you were saying that, yes, indeed, that one of the pillars of the Escazú Agreement is access to information. And we already have an existing ATI, Access to Information Act. So how do you see the Escazú Agreement enhancing what exists for Jamaica?
I was working on a project where we went through the Access to Information Act as well as our justice laws and so on and compared them to the Escazú Agreement. And what you'll see is that there are areas in which, yes, we have an act, but some of the provisions of the act fall short of what's required by Escazú. So for instance, in terms of timeframes, which is one of the major problems people who use the act have, you make an application for information, they're allowed 30 days to give you, and then they can say at the end of 30 days, hey, we need another 30 days. The period on the Escazú is shorter, for instance. Whether or not it will, actually make our people give us information in a shorter time is another question. But there are a number of provisions for Escazú. On the Escazú, that would involve us having to amend our legislation, tighten up the provisions, and make it easier for people to get information.
Do you foresee, because if there are challenges, sometimes no. Because a lot of times we always hear that about the access to information, and if Escazú, the provisions under the Escazú Agreement seems to be a little bit more stringent, or do you foresee that being a challenge in how we may implement it locally?
I foresee it being a challenge in getting our people to ratify it. I've already heard off the record from people in our government that, look, we already have an Access to Information Agreement. There are concerns about signing on to these international agreements like Escazú that are going to then put additional requirements, additional duties and obligations on our government, on our civil service. So there's a hesitation in terms of that. And I would think before we sign on, really, I think we would have to do some more introspection. We've done reviews of our legislation. There's already recommendations on the book. Well, not on the book. There are already recommendations as to how it can be reformed and improved, and those recommendations have been taken on board. So before we do ratification, I would want to see some kind of sincere intent coming from, and I'm not limiting this to any one political party, but coming from government as a whole to show that we do want to take this legislation more seriously, we do want to improve it, we are interested in more open government. And we do, as you know, have a whole open government partnership work is being done on that, and the hope is that that certainly will facilitate greater access to information as well.
So thank you for that. So another question that I have, and sometimes I reflect on public opinion, and sometimes we all know, sometimes public opinion may be formed from a place of not knowing the intricacies, but there's often a lot of criticism that, oh, Jamaica, we don't really have investigative journalism here, and we don't have an expose. But what is your perspective on the role of investigative journalism when it comes to environmental issues, and do you think there's a lack of it here?
Yeah, I mean, we have some people doing great work. I mean, I think that's, if you follow media at all, you will see that. A lot of times people say that to me and I say, okay, do you follow the work of Jovan Johnson, for instance? Do you follow the work of Giovanni Dennis? And people will say no, and I say, okay, so you actually don't know what's happening locally. It's just this kind of knee-jerk criticism we have. Having said that, I think it needs to be understood that more than ever we have a crisis in journalism. It used to be, I used to tell people that people would come into the profession and stay for 5 years and leave. Now it's more than like 1 to 3 years, right? People are coming in and they're just moving on very, very quickly. You cannot acquire critical investigative skills and really a body of work and the kind of deep skills that you need to do the kind of journalism you want to see if you're going to be here for a year or two. And that's a problem we all have to confront. I don't know the answer. One of the answers, of course, is figuring out how to pay people more money. And I don't know what the answer is in that. But it's not reasonable if you're dealing with a newsroom full of cub reporters, people who have less than a year or less than 2 or 3 years in journalism. It's not reasonable to think that you're going to be churning out a whole bevy of investigative journalists, I mean, I'm hoping we can hang on to the few that we currently have.
Yes, and I don't know if it's fair or... Well, what I wanted to say is I do think that for the stores that I have been seeing, I think they're doing a good job. And I certainly think from a Caribbean standpoint, there seems to be more focus on the environmental issues. And so we're happy to see that unfolding. I wanted to circle back to the access to information and the challenges, just to kind of demystify the challenge that journalists have when they say, okay, they're really struggling to get information. Is it that there are legal barriers when they're pushing, or other systemic barriers when they're pushing for certain information to build out their stories?
It's a twofold problem. One is that we do still have reticence on the part of government entities to release information, especially when they think it's information that's going to embarrass the government. You do get that reticence, so you do tend to find people running out the clock. But the other side of it is that many, or maybe most of our journalists don't understand the Access to Information Act, don't know how to use it properly, don't know that if somebody doesn't answer you at all, that is deemed a refusal and you can then appeal that. They don't know the processes of appeal. They don't know that you first can apply for internal review and then you can go to the Independent Access to Information Appeal Tribunal, which has very often given people the information that they've been seeking. People don't know the process, so they'll put in a request, they don't get any response, and they say, "Sure, this doesn't work." It's not going to be easy. Doing work in terms of whether journalism or environmental advocacy, it's never going to be easy. And you just can't give up at the first hurdle you come to, and most of the time that's what's happening.
Right. For some youth in environmental advocacy or environment work, because some of them, they are, technical experts and so on. I've had conversation with people, and sometimes they may experience uncomfortable scenarios professionally, or sometimes it's the fear of something happening or backlash that they probably don't pursue a certain route. I'm not saying this is the case with young journalists, but you may have journalists who, all right, maybe they don't want to run out full force with certain, maybe they want to cover environmental stories or otherwise. What would you say to maybe encourage them in relation to covering stories, or is there any way that they can be protected from any kind of intimidation that may arise?
Yeah, I mean, you have to take it one step at a time. So I do think, first of all, we need more coverage in that area generally. I'd absolutely accept any criticism of that kind. And then you have to think through exactly what you're doing, what are the steps, and if there is going to be blowback, is it that you need, for instance, legal protection? Is it that you need to report the matter to the police? Is it that you need solidarity from the Press Association of Jamaica, the Media Association of Jamaica, because those are organizations that will stand up for you as well. I think the key is not to isolate yourself and to know where you can reach out for help.
Yes. So the Escazú Agreement, as we know, one of its provisions is to provide stronger protections for environmental defenders. And I mean, I think that will also extend to journalists who, participate in environmental reporting and pursue certain stories linked to the environment. What would you say, or how can the Escazú Agreement support greater press freedom for those journalists?
There's always this conversation in Jamaica as the extent to which we have press freedom. And one of the things the late John Maxwell always used to say, who was a huge environmental advocate, did a whole heap of work in environmental advocacy, he always said that he thought we even though our laws are criticized as restrictive, what we need to be doing is pushing more boundaries, do more work. And then if it is we come upon the barriers, we come upon the roadblocks, we can then expose those as well. And we've seen that happen. So for instance, we've seen instances where people have, to use the access to information example, asked for information, they haven't got it. That in itself then becomes a story. Hey, for instance, an unrelated to environment, the Gleaner, for instance, had said, we're trying to get the police commissioner's salary. They said we can't get it under Access to Information Act. And the public was like, hold on, how come? We pay you though. That is not private. You're a public official. You're being paid by taxpayers. We don't care whether you think this should be private. It's not a private issue. And that information was released.
Yes.
So sometimes I think we allow fear to dominate, when we have to push out first and then deal with the situations as they come. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I do think we just need to put ourselves out there more.
Yeah, I was going to say adapt this. When we reach that bridge, we cross it approach.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what we need to look at.
Exactly.
All right, so in winding down, even though in a way you would have alluded to the importance of media in covering environmental stories, but what is the role? Should media have a role in prioritizing environmental justice stories? Or what role should they play in prioritizing?
I'm not sure I understand. You mean if environmental stories should be at the top of our agenda?
Yes, and I don't mean top of the agenda in relation to make it more important than something else. But like we said, I think obviously there has been some growth in how these stories are reported, and you mentioned as well in how we make it more people-centered. And so maybe I shouldn't have used prioritized, but just another dimension of how we can continue to hone.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is education, right? Because I'm going to tell you, the old style of journalism, I used to say there are three stories in Jamaica, politics, economy, and crime. And everything revolves around that, and sometimes politics is the top story, sometimes it's the economy, sometimes it's crime. So it's really getting more people into the industry, into the profession, who understand the importance of a lot of the work that's being done, So we have a Kelisha Williams now who's been doing a lot of work on environmental justice, to use just one example. She's been to workshops, she's participated in courses, so she has a certain level of education in environmental issues. And once you start to get that kind of interest, then people pull that into their work. So a lot of it has to be outreach, you guys reaching out as well and just exposing people to, hey, there are other things other than the police blotter,
Yes.
And the BOJ counter rates. And important as those stories are, there are other very, very important stories that need to be told. And it's not work that ever stops because of the same issue I was alluding to earlier with the kind of high turnover we have in the newsroom. So, I mean, you do a workshop with 10 journalists this year,
Yes.
2 years' time, 8 of them move on to do something else somewhere else, and you have a new set. So it has to be ongoing work, it has to be ongoing education, it has to be ongoing outreach. But I think we're starting to see interest in those stories that I would say wasn't there when I came into journalism a couple of decades ago, and I think that's progress. I always think there's progress.
Definitely. And I love what you said about the ongoing, because even especially within the context of this podcast series, looking at Escazú, I do know that Jet would have coordinated a series of workshops with participation from the journalists and even not that we're promoting one journalist over the other, but certainly with Kalisha, I would have even recalled in previous times when it comes to COP, when there comes to certain issues, we see the kind of interest and the pursuits, and like you said, we're really happy for that. So
yeah, and you have programs. So, for instance, Climate Tracker Caribbean
yes.
has been doing a fellowship program with journalists across the region, and I've heard journalists participating in that say, "Wow, they're seeing climate justice in a way they didn't before." You have Media Institute of the Caribbean, run by Kiran Maharaj, for instance. They do an investigative workshop process, and they also emphasize environmental issues. So a lot of it just has to do with exposure and showing people how you can develop these kinds of stories. CBU, when they do their media awards, for instance, a couple of years ago, they had done an environmental climate justice reporting workshop aligned to the awards that journalists had participated in. And those are the kinds of things that help to open people's eyes and say, hold on, there's a story here, there's a story here, there's a story here.
Right. Well, Dionne, I want to say thank you so much. I think I learned a lot, and I guess I speak on behalf of the audience for taking the time to not just share these insights, but demystify some of the challenges and some of the opportunities, as it relates to improving how we can cover and focus on the environmental issues that can not just improve public understanding, but change the needle in terms of better access to justice and participation as it relates to environmental reporting and addressing environmental issues locally.
Thank you.
There we have it. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Defending Our Rights, Environmental Justice in Jamaica, as we looked at exploring the role of media in amplifying environmental justice issues. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Follow Global Yardie on all listening platforms.